introduction. And so it's a little bit after 8:05 now, and I started getting hungry at 7:30. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks really brief, and so I'll kind of skip over the thank yous. But I just want to express, my appreciation to the Architecture League for this event, and to the great leadership of Annabelle and Rosalie and the whole team there. So I'm going to talk about the office scape, and I thought I would start with a kind of a normal view of the office. And we're here in Manhattan. This is a view of Lainey and Gina, who are here tonight, key people in the office presenting projects to other students. And just so you can imagine what a kind of a normal day at the office would look like, with Elena Brescia sort of in charge and making sure everything is running smoothly. But that very kind of guise of normalcy, I think, is undermined by our sort of working process and methodology, which I like to think of as more of a sort of a maelstrom, or a sort of a whirl of ideas and concepts. And I try to think of myself in a kind of hybrid role of someone who's not only working as a licensed landscape architect, but someone who's trying to hybridize the kind of fields of community organizing, landscape architecture. So this diagram talks about a couple of things. First, it talks about the sort of four key issues that I think drive the practice and drive the thinking and drive the research. Design for biodiversity, the idea of water as a catalyst, reclaiming post-industrial landscapes and residual landscapes, and also thinking about new scenarios for community-based change, which imply completely different ways of working as a designer. It also implies what I'm trying to get at, which is this sort of motion and action and change scenarios where projects sort of engender different sorts of research and engender different types of output. So everything here in gray is a publication. There's design studios. I'm an instructor at Columbia, and there are also projects that are just built projects, and we have a lot of projects in the region: parks, playgrounds, plazas, and so on and so forth. But I really kind of think that what's interesting about our office is that we're issue-based, and I'm very kind of coming at landscape from the lens of politics and art. And I really feel like the future of landscape as a super relevant discipline is that intersection where the idea of land and the human sort of interrelationship with land is now something that needs to be completely politicized and activized. And so that's what we're trying to do. So the other thing I think which is a little bit different about Scape and my work there is that I'm kind of not coming to landscape architecture from a kind of tradition of, well, I worked for this office for 20 years and now I'm doing this stuff. It's not coming from kind of art historical background. It's really coming from, to sort of toggle back, and I was thinking about this event being called Emerging Voices. I was trying to think about, well, what is the voice and where did it come from? Kind of really goes back to, toggling fairly far back, but to my undergraduate days at University of Virginia, where I was a major in political and social thought, which had kind of drawn me to that program. Richard Rorty, the philosopher, was the director there. And I basically put together a major which reflected my interests, and that was ecofeminism. And it was a melding of sort of international development, of anthropology, political sciences, fine art, and sustainability. And so I wrote this thesis, which focused on case studies of 3 women in Africa, India, and the United States, and basically how women's real lives and sort of politics of landscape were intertwined. So from there, I went to the GSD at Harvard and was actually one of Rem Koolhaas's first thesis students in what is called now the Project on the City. So I think going into Harvard thinking, hey, I'm going to be wearing loafers and walking around in like a big sun hat and telling people where to plant things really opened me up to this notion of sort of urbanism and the idea of sort of a research-generated putting your eyes on reality and trying to engage and understand what's happening in the world and trying to theorize it and understand it and engage in it. So basically those kind of 2 sets of backgrounds, both of which have writing projects as their output, were really influential in the idea of Scape. And in fact, the word Scape comes from a chapter that I wrote in that book. So the other thing I want to emphasize is that Scape is trying to position itself and, as a way of like, how do you plug into the world, right? We've kind of all heard about global climate change and these kind of trends in the world, the staggering loss of biodiversity, the acidification of the oceans, massive environmental issues which are just seem to be completely beyond our reach. So just as we are able to describe them, they seem to be completely, we seem to be unable to do anything. But I think that landscape in particular is poised right at this intersection of kind of extraction energy, land use, soil, atmosphere, and ocean. So we're not only at this sort of crux between the past and energy sources and the future, we're at this crux between land use and environment. And I really feel like, landscape architecture can be so deeply marginalized, the subconsultants of the subconsultants of the subconsultants, that it's pathetic, and that somehow landscape architecture needs to kind of lead the charge to reframe the entire argument about the built environment with landscape at the center. And the other thing that implies in thinking about climate change is that this time, this is a quote from Betsy Colbert, is that this time the cataclysm is us. This is not some kind of forces that have dropped down from outer extraterrestrial world. This is, in fact, the trends in the environment and development now have been made by human hands. And so I think that's the other reason why in this graph, the notion of kind of community-based change is really important. And thinking about how do you act as a designer and as a landscape architect? How do you engage? Because the climate change situation has evolved from a series of millions and billions of micro actions, and now it will require the same and a kind of a more collaborative effort to unmake or remake that situation. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the bubbles in the graph, and the first one is design for biodiversity, and touch on some of the issues here, some of the publications and some of the projects. It's as probably devastatingly clear that we've designed the planet to be habitat for humans, and in often cases excluding habitat for animals and for plants. And so one of the first projects that I actually got after starting Scape was in a collaboration with Studio Gang, and it was called the Calumet Environmental Center. But my whole kind of focus on this project was redesigning what was, and these are graphics from 2004, which is sort of embarrassing, but was redesigning sort of successional landscape and thinking about how a very decrepit, over 100-acre site that was a dumping ground for Ford automobiles and fuels could be folded in over time to host a richer, diverse array and layering of species. So we not only did a kind of master plan for that, which became the basis for a plan in Chicago moving forward, then we also did CDs for that site and a 30-acre parcel of it, which took years, right? Your small office of 3 or 4 people. So, and it was a gorgeous CD set, which is in some archives in different universities. And classic first project goes on hold, right? Out. And so, but with this kind of spirit of moving forward and trying to be effectual, one of the things, being kind of hyper bird lover, and I'm sure there are some bird lovers secreted out there in the audience as well. I had been volunteering with the New York City Audubon Society as a volunteer at what's called Project Safe Flight, which is when birds collide with buildings. There are sets of volunteers who go and collect the bird carcasses and actually try to understand the situation. So I had ended up doing mapping of the volunteer routes, because we would have these meetings and everyone would be like, are you going there tomorrow? And so it became kind of a real need. But I began talking with the president of the Audubon at the time, like, can't we do something proactive about this? And so we came up with this proposal and won a grant from Fish and Wildlife Service to do bird-safe building design guidelines. So this is a kind of a booklet that became freely accessible and downloadable to architects, managers, etc. And in the contents, we kind of outline causes and solutions for bird-safe building design. So the idea here is that we can have cities. Cities are good, but we need to be able to design them in such a way that they provide coexistence. And basically, the entire Scape portfolio is filled with projects that design habitat jointly for people and kind of learning landscapes, and also for animals and plants. So this is just a quick view of one of our projects at the Blue Wall Center, and it's about a 15-acre site. The idea is we're using forest succession to grow up and carve out specific rooms that are designed for habitat, and for not only habitat for the animals, but for learning about habitat. So we have a rare plants room, a kind of toad abode, bat cave, and so on. And we were working with experts and stakeholders in the area. The rooms also became this way of kind of organizing the circulation, and also a kind of a framework for donors and framework for stakeholders. So we were beginning to work with the Native Plant Society there, with the sort of Audubon group, with the Herpetological Society, and it actually became not only a framework for the site, but a framework for stakeholder and community engagement. And here's just a view of one of those bat rooms that we also went really far on and then went on hold. But so, I think the idea of biodiversity and thinking about the notion of interaction with the landscape, you can also, I have a 4-year-old girl, and at night I'm always reading her books, like, oh, this is Ronnie the rhinoceros, and I think in my head, oh, there are 9 Sumatran rhinoceroses left in the world. And so I really thought that, I think landscape has a role also in kind of communication. So this is a kind of guerrilla project I did for the Shenzhen Biennale, which was to kind of take this guidebook of my childhood, which is called American Wildflowers, and transform it into a guide to the flowers that are still here. And so with each page, we kind of began to intervene in the pages of the book, remap the extinction patterns, and it became a sort of a window into not only what is here now, but also what was there. And I think that that's an important idea, that we're not only rewriting the maps, which are our climate maps. USDA just came out with a new zoning map, but we're actually rewriting species guides in this case. And we have done that with our actions. So the next project is a joint project with Urban Landscape Lab, which I run at Columbia with Jeanette Kim, and MTWTF, the graphic design studio. It's called Safari 7. And I started the Landscape Lab at Columbia with this notion about research. I promptly submitted probably 10 proposals for really thick binders for the NSF, for all these major research funding projects. Nothing, right? I put together, horseshoe crab restoration in Jamaica Bay. Nothing. So we started Safari 7, which is a kind of a guerrilla student-based project to highlight the number 7 line as a sort of urban eco-safari trip, as a sort of burst of frustration and wanting to engage and trying to understand, like, what could we do now? But it turns out that you could actually do a lot, except that this image looks weird and it's inverted. But this is an image of people looking out of the subway train, listening to podcasts, and kind of understanding the sort of diverse ecology, because the project reframed the number 7 train as kind of a transect through multiple ecosystems, from the bedrock of Manhattan through under the East River and out into the glacial outwash plains of Queens. So this project involved, a website, exhibit, a kind of a set of drawings and cross sections through the different stations to try to understand what sorts of habitats and what sorts of unique and unanticipated relationships evolve between humans, animals, and plants. So we have things like vacant and full, which was an ecology of an empty lot, and something like cut and fill habitat, which is the habitat was sort of an accidental habitat that was made from the excavation of the Steinway Tunnel, which was piled up in the East River, which has now surprisingly become key habitat for the black-crested cormorant. Very weird. So here's a view of that kind of cut and fill habitat, and the way that as you're riding the 7 line, you can listen and learn, and you can also download these images and visit the exhibit. So this was exhibited not only at the Studio X space at Columbia, but we took it on the road. This is a view of Grand Central Station, and Helen, who's here, was also in charge of kind of programming and bringing in local school groups. So it wasn't just a project that was in the academy. This was a project that was kind of broadcast, and and we had co-programming with the Hall of Science. Flyers were distributed at the US Open. And so it became this kind of really great way of kind of bringing the concepts of urban ecology to a really broad audience, and began to connect more closely with communities and school groups along the 7 line. So that kind of brings me to this topic of community-based change. And with this, we have a couple of different theses about how this evolves. One is through the idea of reports, like freely downloadable reports, like Envisioning Gateway and the Bird Safe Building Guidelines. And the other one is through the idea of sort of learning landscape. And then key in the conceptualization of community-based change, I think, is that architecture and design is no longer a one-way kind of framework where I'm presenting to a community board for input, but rather I think we have to kind of revise that and think about it more as a participatory and two-way exchange. And so a lot of our projects are trying to do that. So for example, this is a project called This is Newark, and with M2W2F. And the idea here is we were asked to design a gateway to Newark. So my thought on this was that rather than design a sort of a singular architectural gesture or gateway at the edge, if you could redefine the center and the fabric of Newark itself, then you would immediately know that you were in Newark. So we came up with this idea of a sort of a massive tree planting program that in defining what would be sponsored and invested in by the government, what would be invested in by local communities and businesses. And basically trying to turn the sock inside out in terms of, rather than making a gateway or an edge, we remade the center. And so this became a really interesting sort of identity program that began to kind of map out how that might actually happen, and laying out the lines to understand the tree species, the neighborhoods, and the conditions, and so on, and making a kind of an app where we could kind of communicate that very clearly. Another example of what I would call community-based or driven design is this project, which was done in collaboration with the New York Restoration Project. And NYRP had done all of this programming and outreach with this community in East Harlem. This is a garden up on 103rd Street. So, and they came back with this document, like the community would like X, the community would like Y, and it became this kind of grab bag wish list. But I actually saw that as being really interesting and really important, because if the community actually got what they wanted instead of a sort of Scape napkin sketch design, that it would be super successful and super interesting. So, I mean, literally, this park became a party, which was just super basic, which is a gesture, like a path gesture that combines 4 different programs together, and a kind of a cross that combines 4 different programs together. So, and so here's a kind of, the other key thing about this project was that rather than some super detailed master plan, I wanted to draw something that basically anybody who was a volunteer, and this would be volunteer built, would immediately be able to understand and be completely operative on. So this could not be clearer, and it became this kind of scaffolding which just helped to organize all of the work and became just incredibly useful tools. So I think this is an example of a design as tool, just as bird safe building guidelines are a tool for others to do things. And so it's characterized by the cross and the loop, and then 2 buildings which are literally mirrors of each other that collect rainwater and provide cisterns for the different programs. In this case, a kind of community garden, urban farm. So here's like volunteer day, right? Everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, where things go, and you can start to see the delineations for rooms. And then what it looked like, after volunteer day, which I think is really interesting and exciting, because a lot of this stuff was just donated materials that we worked with. But I think the kind of clarity of the plan and the clarity of the kind of thinking helped this thing move forward and be a big success. So again, it's kind of 4 distinct rooms, but what became interesting is that implied 4 very different reasons to come, and the park is like super successful because it actually doesn't bring one type of person. It brings teenagers playing basketball, it brings little kids playing on the equipment, it brings kind of seniors and others who are kind of tending the gardens. So the other key thing, and which Claire mentioned was in the Oyster-tecture project, is that water has also been a kind of a very, very clarifying and important kind of idea for me to engage in, because I think ultimately it's the opposite of land to some degree, right? Like water and land are in this incredible dynamic, and water is always shifting, always in motion, owned by nobody, and it really kind of represents, to me, the kinds of thinking that we'll need to be doing for the era of global climate change, right? We kind of all have to work together in a watershed to make something happen. It's not a land-based, market-driven ideology where land is parceled up and this is my little piece of land and I'm going to just take care of it. Water in itself is connecting and synthesizing. So I feel like water is a true catalyst in like the thinking of the office and also in the sort of physical evolution of the office. So we've done waterfront projects. This is a project on the East River, which preserved a kind of an old Cass-Gilbert warehouse, opened it up to the public, and sort of planted the edges. There's a sort of waterfront restoration down below, which provides habitat, and folded that sort of boardwalk into the interior. But what I want to talk about more in terms of water is that this project, which is a publication which started as a research project at Columbia, and it's called Gateway, Vision for Urban National Park, and Gateway National Recreation Area, as you might know, is on the sort of periphery of New York. It was once the center of New York, the center of kind of Lenape settlement, and now it's really on the edge. It became a dumping ground in the early 1900s. It was closed because of contaminated with sewage, and basically I wrote this kind of essay in 06, 07 that talked about the framework of the watershed as something that's catalytic and potentially transformative. And also the tenets of that essay were that communities and the sort of community in the joint water and sewer shed there could work together and begin to kind of come up with sort of a new thinking, acting, and political template that would imply dispersed action throughout the watershed rather than singular, hard infrastructural fix. So that kind of thinking was great backup for the Rising Currents project, and we were invited to submit for this project that was organized by Barry Bergdahl. And so I felt like the Jamaica Bay Watershed project was incredible in that it gave me this really, really strong approach that anything you have to do with water has to be kind of community-based. And so we we asked, rather than asking, Joe engineer, marine engineer, to join our team, we asked the Harbor School, which is a local school that's invested in kind of teaching and using the New York City Harbor as a kind of a base for learning, and some local leaders and in the nonprofits in the area to be part of our team. So we came up with this kind of vision, which was called Oyster-tecture, which basically capitalizes on the life cycle of the oyster reinterpreted at a kind of urban design scale, in which the sort of the Gowanus Canal, which is kind of newly cleaned from Superfund intervention, becomes this sort of breeding ground and spat farm for oysters, which are then seeded out in a reef, out at the Bay Ridge Flats, and starts to, from a cycle which is sort of devastating and downgrading, and to restart this cycle and reach into one that is kind of regenerative and life-giving. And so the reef itself also has qualities of wave attenuation. The oysters clean the water, and so the idea was that there's this sort of joint biological and community-based strategy that could be put in play. So here's just a view of that reef and how it can calm waters during a sort of storm event, and how the water is then cleaned and becomes slower and cleaner. And with this kind of slower, cleaner water, you can actually imagine a new relationship in living with the water. And here's a kind of view of the fabric that could evolve once we have cleaner, slower water. This is what we're calling kind of the new Gowanus. And a view of that reef, which we're calling sort of the Palisades Bay Reef, which we were imagining was becoming a sort of amphibious central park for the region. The idea is also that with kind of flexible biological infrastructure, that this biological infrastructure could grow and change with time and evolve alongside climate change. So we're starting to do a pilot project now out in the Gowanus Bay, which we're really excited about, and that will be the topic of another lecture. So finally, I have two more things I want to show. One is just another project called Confluence, which was done. We invited the living to participate in this with us, and we're really interested and excited because aspects of this seem to be moving forward in Pittsburgh. So this is a project where we were asked to rethink this portal. There's a portal which is essentially sort of the underbelly of a highway that connects Pittsburgh with this green state park at its point. And so what we did was sort of reimagine the portal as a kind of hub for environmental learning and make it occupiable and inhabitable and basically interweave environmental information and data into the landscape of the portal itself. So what you're seeing is a sort of a scenario of clean water and dirty water alerts. The notion of the floor of the portal bridge itself becomes kind of fish finder, and we have restored habitat off the edge of the point, which is manifest in this kind of dynamic LED fish finder floor. That the presence of people and fish, schools of people and schools of fish are kind of mirrored on the ceiling through shadow. And then also there's a historic sort of rectangular fountain as part of the portal, and we interpret that fountain and connected it to two locks that determine water quality and flow. So there are different aspects of this landscape that are both, incredibly comfortable and interesting, but also educative. So these are the things that we're measuring: water quality through light color, fish flow through the pattern, people flow through the shadow, and river growth through the water level. This was my first sketch, which was sort of showed how we're trying to loop and connect the portal to the point to the Carnegie Science Museum, which is one of the great attractors of the region, and how sort of eco-dock, what we're proposing sort of eco-dock and a science barge, could begin to regenerate and make the river and the water kind of the new center of the landscape. A view of that floor and sort of fish finder landscape that's generated, and how we began to evolve the portal bridge that connects both sides in a way that maintains all the emergency clearances and so on, but then makes the edges accessible for small school groups. So these little dots here are orange, and orange people. And showing how a sort of school group or cluster could begin to work around one of these little work tables that we were envisioning. But more importantly, one of the things we learned, we had a hydrologist on our team also named John Colby, and one of the things we learned is that there's this incredible sort of water vortex that emerges from the two flows of the river which join, and that creates incredible fishing. And so bass fishing, we learned, is actually, there's the Super Bowl of bass fishing occurs here. So we got really interested in where are the fish and how does that work. So our project sort of provided enhanced habitat down at the base of the portal. And what we found was that you can sort of employ this Didson imagery, which I think is incredibly beautiful. You can see a large fish swimming through here. And that Didson imagery from the underneath the science barge would actually be relayed in sort of real time to the floor of the portal itself. There's also a low-tech way of engaging community activists and stakeholders, and that is we designed these tables to have a very, very simple, low-tech, reprogrammable top. And this was super interesting for all the different groups that are involved in multiple histories of this area. And so this programmable tabletop can become a kind of focal point, and again, a sort of a pinch point for community stakeholder involvement and funding for the project. Here's a view of the science barge and how it interacts with the programming at the Carnegie Science Center, which is located here. They already have a dock, and basically the State Park Service said, we're just going to do that, so I'm really excited about that. You never hear that in your projects, right? And then finally, a view of the fish monitor, the Didson camera here, looking at the enhanced bass habitat. And we looked at all these kind of marine architectural structures that would enhance bass habitat. So everyone gets to win the $1 million prize. And here's a view of that Didson monitor feeding into the portal floor. And the last thing I thought was interesting to highlight in this project is this kind of new scenario of river-based energy generation. Of course, Pittsburgh is known for coal, but they also have these incredible rivers. So we learned from Colby that there are these ways that you can actually harness energy even from the slowest moving rivers, and it's called Vortex shedding technology. Here's a view of that technology installed underneath the Fort Duquesne Bridge, and a view of how it works. It's called Vortex shedding. Let's see if that works. It's totally cool. It's worth seeing. And so how it works is that almost like the actual fins of a fish, even the slowest moving water creates a ripple or a vortex, which pushes this machine up and down, and which generates mechanical energy. So this is, for me, was this fascinating moment which brought together not just like oyster-tecture, the sort of biology of the fish and the sort of new ways that we have to think about energy landscapes. So finally, I want to close on a project which is called Petrochemical America, which is a project that was done, with the idea of kind of thinking about reclamation not only of sort of post-industrial landscapes, but of the American landscape and the residual kind of suburban landscape that we all take for granted that will always be here. So this is a collaboration with the photographer Richard Misrak, who I feel like is one of the greatest photographers of American photographers of his generation. He pioneered these large format photographs and has always focused on kind of human interface with landscape. He photographed the bombing of the desert, for example. And he, along with Struth and Bertinsky and so on, have really kind of pushed the reframing and our even understanding of the landscape that we have made in wild and new directions. So it was super interesting for me to meet Richard and think about collaborating with him. And because I don't think we can underestimate the power of photography to make change. So my thought after meeting him was that we would basically take his photographs, kind of think about them as a sequence almost, and retell a story through our own eyes, but also using the photographs as a kind of a launching point. So this sketch talks about that with every photograph, there's a kind of a global layer, there's a sort of local site-based layer, there's a kind of a regional layer, and that these layers that are implicit but kind of under the surface of what he has seen could be brought to the surface and brought into kind of a poetic sort of narrative. So that's really what the book does, and it's coming out in about 2 weeks, so I'm really excited. So here's that kind of idea of the unraveling and the sort of sorting of the photographs. This is just a graphic map of the first chapter, and how 2 photographs are woven together in a kind of dialogue about what oil has wrought on the American landscape, ending in a kind of diagram of all of the petrochemicals that have been produced. And I neglected to say, but the book is about specifically a zone between New Orleans and Baton Rouge in Louisiana, where there are over 100 petrochemical plants. So this is like page 1 of the book, which is where do we begin our story? And the answer is we begin the story way deep under the sea, where these sort of hydrocarbons have been forming. And so the book basically goes through and graphically kind of unravels and unpacks the sort of story of oil and petrochemistry in the landscape. This is just another kind of a zoom into one of the pages, which shows how basically we've gone from, we've basically reverted back now to the atmospheric qualities from the Pleistocene era. And that the idea of these sort of hydrocarbons have moved from the earth to the sky only in a matter of like 200 years, and this is what's happened in our climate. So this is an example of a kind of a raw Richard Misrak photo, which is incredibly beautiful, and of course the projection does not do it justice, but there's an incredible amount of detail. But one of the stories, so this is an example of how it appears in the book, framed here, which you can't actually see, but framed here. And the idea with this sort of sequence and this chapter was to kind of unpack this image. Why are there ghostly poles within what is a sort of, one would think to be a sort of super robust bayou landscape? So the drawing kind of unpacks the healthy ecosystem and also the degraded ecosystem and what the factors are, salinization, the introduction of chemicals, atrazines, so on and so forth, that make what was a healthy bayou landscape into ghostly poles. And so here's a kind of a close-up view of the sort of healthy cycle that connects animals and sort of interconnection of the ecosystem that makes up a healthy bayou, and a focus on this sort of saltwater intrusion, the presence of hydrocarbon residues, sinking ground, subsidence, and sort of rising water levels that mean that this ecosystem cannot survive. So we looked also, I think, in the book at multiple scales, from the scale of the microsite out to the scale of the American landscape. And this kind of cycle of ecological robustness and also ecological destruction is also mapped. And this, what's shown in green here, shows land loss due to subsidence. And you know, the levees are now dumping silt way out into the off the continental shelf, and as a result, basically, the land of the lower Mississippi is subsiding and being lost. And so finally, you know, the question was, how do you engage, right? Because I think the key part of this lecture is that I'm trying to formulate ways of engaging in a landscape that seems to be beyond our ability to come to terms with it. And so what we did for Petrochemical America is not only to try to map out and visualize the factors and the forces and the cycles and the systems that make up the American landscape and the suburbanized world that we're living in, but then we came up with this idea of doing a glossary of terms and solutions for a post-petrochemical culture. And that glossary highlights not only specific scenarios for places, but then through a series of interviews and through research, we began to focus and shine a spotlight on some of the organizations, not only in Louisiana, but all over the US, who are kind of trying to change the world in their way. And so the idea was that this glossary is something that could also be produced independently and given out to anyone. So that's my last slide, and I hope that with my super quick lecture, I've managed to communicate to you all the things that we're interested in and that we're trying to do, however messily and however in this kind of wild world of thinking and action. Thanks.